We call it Your Take, a chance for you to ask questions directly to experts. And joining us is someone who's getting a lot of phone calls right about now because he is Kris Hall with Meadowbrook Insurance. Obviously, insurance right now with everything that's been happening with the flooding all over Metro Detroit, the Grosse Pointes, Detroit, and so many other places right now suffering. And Kris, you know, we've been getting a lot of questions as well. We thought we'd bring you into the fold tonight and talk about this. The first question comes to us from Kristen saying, I wonder how many people in Detroit have flood insurance that is normally a separate policy. A fail could potentially leave devastation, goes on to say, for some, and line the pockets of others. When you hear something like that, give us an idea as to what it is that you'd like people to know.
Wow. Well, it's one of those things that really boils down to education around insurance. A lot of people have no idea that flood isn't even covered by a homeowner's policy. And, you know, there's reasons behind that. But the bottom line is you really need to take a look at your policy, talk to your agent. And water is such a touchy subject when it comes to insurance. So if you live in one of these areas that are prone to floods or water backups, you really need to take a close look at your policy and, you know, make sure that you're not caught off guard at the time of the claim to make sure that, you know, if you need assistance, it's going to be there for you. So
another question that we've been getting, and you've been getting a lot of, is are flooded basements covered by homeowners insurance? How do you, how do you answer that?
Sure. Well, the term flood is, again, it's very defined in the insurance world. So you have two things that might come to your remedy at the time of a loss. So if it's actually a true flood, the water encroached from the outside. And as we just discussed, that is a completely separate policy called a flood policy. A lot of people don't think to buy flood insurance, or they don't think they need it because they're not located in a next to a lake or a river. But the other thing that you may have coverage for is what's called water backup. Water backup's a little different. That's when the water comes up from, in most cases, when we're talking basement, it's going to be a sump pump. So, you know, don't assume that you don't have coverage. It's always a good idea to contact your insurance provider. Don't tell them you have a flood or water backup. Let them take the facts of the situation and guide you through the process.
We have another question coming from Lisa, who's a Fox 2 viewer, who basically is talking about what the mayor of these cities can do to help with rescue fund money and one federal money. And one thing that we know is that FEMA is coming to town day after tomorrow to kind of assess the situation, check things out. But this person's asking specifically about Detroiters. Some insurance don't even offer flood coverage in Detroit. Residents in Detroit just went through this 6 months ago. This is beyond ludicrous. When you talk about Detroiters having flood coverage or not having flood coverage, what is it that you'd like them to know? Because you talk about the different types of coverage, right?
Right. And, you know, sometimes when you buy a home, the mortgage company will require you to buy flood insurance if they've determined that you're in a high-risk zone. But aside from that, most people, again, don't even know that these policies exist or had no idea that they might need it. But basically, flood insurance is categorized depending on your floodplain in the area that you live in the country. There's basically high, medium, and low-risk zones. Again, most people are aware if they're in a high-risk zone, but Roop, 25% of the claims that are filed on a flood insurance policy come from either low or medium risk zones. So it's always a good idea to know your risk. There's a great website called floodsmart.gov that you can punch in your address and get an idea of where your property lies in the 100-year floodplain and to help you make an educated decision of whether or not you should purchase flood insurance or not.
Lots more viewer questions coming in right now. Another one that you've gotten as well, does auto insurance cover floods in any way? And if so, how?
Right. Well, so with auto insurance, it's a different story. We are all familiar with the term full coverage. Really what that means is you have collision coverage and comprehensive coverage, the latter being kind of the catch-all for anything that's not a collision. So for those of you who have full coverage on your vehicle, that implies that you also have comprehensive. Comprehensive is the part of your policy that will typically cover a flood. So especially if you have a loan on your vehicle, you most likely have full coverage on your vehicle. Unfortunately, for those of us with PLPD, that means you don't have any collision or comprehensive, and unfortunately, those expenses will be out of pocket.
Well, Kris Hall, we have many more questions coming to us from Fox 2 viewers right now. We're going to come back in the 6 o'clock hour and talk more to you about exactly how all this stuff works. It's called Your Take. Kris Hall with Meadowbrook Insurance taking your questions right now about this really frustrating situation. We'll have much more tonight on Fox 2 News at 6.
It's been more than a week since devastating floods swept across Metro Detroit, but the cleanup is far from over.
Many people are dealing with damaged homes and belongings right now, and they're left with a lot of questions about the extensive and expensive repairs. Here's Fox News' Roop with more in Your Take.
It's called Your Take, a chance for you to ask questions directly to our experts. And yes, with all the flooding in Metro Detroit, there are a lot of questions about insurance. Joining us now, Kris Hall with Meadowbrook Insurance. And Kris, it's good to see you. Thanks for joining us. Lots of questions coming in from Fox 2 viewers about the situation as it stands. And certainly a lot of it stands in water as we speak. What are the main concerns and calls that you're getting right now from your customers? What are the biggest misconceptions that you'd like to bust through about insurance?
Sure. Well, we have two scenarios, right? People with basements that are flooded underwater. Does a homeowner's policy cover water in the basement? But then we have the other side of the coin. We saw cars completely underwater, and a lot of people want to know, is flood or water damage covered on an auto policy? So we're taking a lot of calls on that, trying to educate people about the difference between flood coverage and, for instance, water backup coverage on a homeowner's policy, and also the implications of your coverage on your auto policy and whether or not it's going to cover the water damage.
So when we take a look at our policies, if moving into the future, what should we be thinking about? Should we get both the water backup and the flood?
Well, it's one of those things that, not everybody is in a high-risk zone for flood. I've been telling clients that there's a website out there called floodsmart.gov that you can visit. You can plug in your address, or, of course, us as insurance agents have the ability to kind of help you analyze your risk as well. A lot of times flood policies are optional. If you're not in a high-risk area, it's really on you to decide if you want to pay the extra expense for flood coverage or not.
Let's talk about some of these viewer questions. One of them coming to us from a person who's talking about local news, going to run a story, talking about us, saying we're going to run a story about insurance companies when you file your claim for your home being flooded or your car submerged because so many of the Detroit area pumping stations failed. Why is flood insurance so difficult? When you look at that, people are confused by what they see. They're confused about what they have, and they're confused about why certain things aren't covered. It is pretty confusing if you're not into this, right? If it's not something you look at every day.
Well, that's true. And the definition of flood is very precise in the insurance world. And it's always tricky because whether or not something is covered is largely going to depend on where the water came from. So when you have surface water that encroaches on a home from an outside body of water, more often than not, that's going to be deemed to be a flood, which, again, like we just discussed, is going to require a separate flood policy in order to be covered. However, if water originates from within the home, for instance, if you have like a sump pump in your basement that failed due to being overwhelmed, then that is what's called water backup. And again, it's not covered by default, but a lot of people have endorsements on their homeowner's policy that will cover some, if not all, of the water backup. So you really need to take a look at your policy and work with your insurance agent to help figure out if you have coverage for these things.
There's a lot of frustration out there right now with everyone who's dealing with a flooded basement. Beatles resists talking to Fox 2, saying insurance companies want us to pay for two different policies so they can make sure that regular homeowners insurance only covers certain types of water damage, but not all flooding. When you hear that type of frustration, I'm sure you're getting those types of calls. What do you tell them?
Well, I also share in that frustration myself. And, the thing is, the insurance company we do the best that we can given the risk profile of the area. And we've all seen across the country how devastating flood claims can be. So, there's the flip side of that coin. If you live on the top of a hill and are at zero risk for a flood, would you want to pay an extra $200-300 a year on your insurance policy to cover something that you're not very likely to use? So there's always two sides of the coin. And the best thing to do is just get good insurance consulting, talk with an agent that's actually going to ask questions about your home and help you figure out, what type of coverage you need to make sure that you're not caught off guard in a situation like we've seen in the past week.
Final question. A lot of people asking about what's the difference between a flood and a water backup. When you take a look at these two, how easy is it to tell right away? And talk a little bit about the kind of that gray area that you kind of see sometimes.
Sure. Well, I wouldn't say that that's even our job as consumers. I would say, present your insurance company the facts of the situation and let them determine if it's going to be a flood or a water backup. In other words, if I'm filing a claim with my insurance carrier, I'm not calling and saying, hey, I had a flood at my house. Just give them the facts of the situation, and, you might have coverage and not expected. So, if you have water backup coverage, if the water came from within a sump pump, for instance, you could have coverage on your policy. policy without having to need a separate flood policy. So it really just boils down to communication and relaying all the pertinent information to your insurance carrier and let them guide you through the process.
A lot to sort through, not only in the basement, but in the paperwork upstairs. Kris Hall with Meadowbrook Insurance. It's good to see you. Thanks for joining us here on Your Take. If you have any questions, you, of course, can hit us up on our Fox 2 Twitter page and ask us your questions to insurance agents about what it is that you're dealing with. Roop, Fox 2 News.